a lot of comic creators, they spend a lot of time focusing on their superheroes, developing their powers, their abilities, their secret identity. They work really hard on making the hero the best they possibly can be. But when it comes down to the villain, this is where, they don't take that type of effort. And what happens when you don't take the time to develop your bad guy is your story just falls apart because a lot of people they underestimate the impact the bad guy has on the story. And people don't understand that your bad guy is very critical to your comic book paradigm or your fantasy paradigm, um, and moving the story forward because your villain is your primary driving force for conflict. I mean, what the villain wants to do usually sets the obstacle. He's the guy who sets up all the obstacles for the hero to overcome. And watching them, fail is one of the big points of the thing because they also have obstacles they have to overcome. They have to, overcome whatever the hero is putting in front of them. But a lot of people they spend a lot of time on the hero, but they don't focus on the villain. Now, the villain, as I always saw it, was one of the core and most essential pieces to a fantasy or a comic book story. And I always start with the villains first, and their character development because the villain is the person. Again, they drive the story, they drive most of the conflict, and they usually establish the primary conflict in the story. So you really have to take the time to develop your villain, more so than your hero. I say in some cases, this is how I approach storytelling. Is that I always take the time to establish that villain, what they want to do, what they're about, and their backstory, more than anything else. Because when you have your bad guy pretty much in place, your story with the hero is a little easier to put together. Um, I've done this quite a few times, with different books like the ISIS series or Temptation of John Haynes, and even in other books like the All About Nikki, All About Marilyn books, I've always focused on that heel character because a lot of people, what I've learned is because I was talking to one of my cousins and he said he liked the bad guys, and I took from that, that people do identify with your villain. They identify with they relate to the bad guy, and they have to have that connection with the bad guy, just like they have to have that connection with the good guy. Um, because both characters are essential, and people have to relate to both characters and identify with their traits, in order for them to really get immersed in the story and really get involved with the story. Um, and when you're looking at a lot of people, they really underestimate your bad guys because I saw this in a lot of milestone comics. Back in the day, they had these great heroes like your icons, your statics, and your hardwares, but there really wasn't much of a rogues gallery for the characters to build upon, and it really started to make a lot of their stories suffer a lot, especially towards the end of the milestone publication thing. And I always looked at that because I bought all the comics, and I always looked at that and said, where are the bad guys? And I look at comic books today, and I go, where are the bad guys? Because a lot of times you see heroes, they're fighting each other, and this shows, the writer really doesn't have strong craft because, or they're just too emotionally attached and they don't want to see, their favorite hero getting beat up. But a hero get losing is part of the paradigm. I mean, that's the first part of the conflict. I mean, that's plot point one usually. The hero gets beat at because all comics follow the same story model as your pulps, your westerns, your soap operas, and it's because it's a three-act model. And in the first act, the hero usually gets beat by the bad guy. In the second act, with plot point two, the hero finds out the villain's weakness as they fight to a draw. And then in the third act, the hero beats the bad guy, and the story wraps up to the conclusion. And we see how it relates to the secret identities story. I mean, secret identities conflict in their personal life, and from this is how your story model comes together. And a lot of people they don't understand how that works. So then that's what really keeps the characters in your story from being the best it can be, because they don't really focus on that villain. And whenever I write stories, I always, look at that villain first. And I have done this in numerous books um, in my career. And I always focus on that bad guy because I know that they're going to drive the conflict. I know they're going to drive the story. And they're going to really, and sometimes I use them to set up a story, like in the case of ISIS, The Ultimate Fight. Um, I use the Greek goddess Nemesis to the opening scene is her fighting in the octagon, and that sets up the story for the ultimate fight, and then that leads to her finding about ISIS, and then going to issue a challenge to her because she's in the arena. She's beating up these MMA fighters. And then after she finishes the fight, Hermes comes out and tells her about ISIS, and then she wants to go challenge her, and that starts the story. And the same thing, in the ISIS Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, I use that setup as well, where you see the villain Rahima Sanders um, getting ready to do perform this experiment on herself, and then because she wants powers like ISIS, and it pretty much sets up the story. And when you have a good bad guy, that's how they really do make the stories more interesting, because if you have the bad guys, again, reader has to identify with the bad guy, they have to relate to the bad guy, they have to have something that they want to be. Because one of the things I learned from watching WWE wrestling is that the bad guy has to do things that the hero can't do or won't do, but it has to be stuff that the viewer would like to see done. Because people, they look at bad guys, they think that, oh, that's just somebody there. It's just somebody there for them to beat up on. And that's not what good storytelling is. Usually, some comics I've seen, and fantasy stories I've seen, the bad guy is just seen as a jobber who just sits there. He's just paid. He just sits there to get beat up and show how great the hero is. And that's not really what good storytelling is. Your bad guy is there to bring out the best in the hero, and to show us why the hero is important and why the hero is necessary, and to really push that conflict along, and just establish that conflict and establish that reason for why we need the hero. I read somewhere, they said that the villains, usually the big villains, are usually the polar opposite of your superhero, and they represent the polar opposite of their ideologies and values. And this is very true. And what I find when I do villains that are the polar opposite of a character like an ISIS, like with the case of Rahima Sanders, or a Nemesis, or a Amari, that they work very well because they will bring out that chemistry in the character. They will challenge their principles, their values, their ideologies, their beliefs, and we see what they stand for and why it's important to them, and why these principles mean so much to them, because these villains are, when they push the conflict, are really challenging who they are and what they stand for, what their core values are, and they show us why these core values that this character has are truly important. And a lot of people, they look at, when they don't understand, how this how the villain's role synergizes with the hero's role. But when I've read a lot of good fantasy and bad fantasy, good comics and bad comics, and when you see these story elements working together, you start to understand how they fit with each other, how the chemist how that really makes the chemistry swirl, and how it makes the story's energy remain strong, so that when you go from the first page to the last page, you get an enjoyable story. And a lot of times people, they, again, as creators, they overlook that villain. They don't really take that time to develop that villain, um, and their stories really suffer because they focus so much, giving this hero these great powers, this great costume, the fantastic origin. But when it comes to the bad guy, the entire story just he's not there. He's just basically like a jobber. He just comes in, he gets beat up, and that's the end of him. And that's not really what a good story is about. Now once in a while, you do need a story like this here and there, as a filler, or but you don't want that to be the main thing all the time. You really want to build those villains up because those villains, they're the ones who are going to sell the comic. I always come say this, your hero is what is why people buy the comic, but your villain is why people was what sells comics, because the villain is what keeps people coming back for that second issue, that third issue. You know, they're the ones who really sell the storylines to the reader. And there's what people don't. And the whole thing is that a good bad guy is not going to shock you. They're gonna bring highs and lows, but they don't need to be gimmicky or anything like that. They just have to have a motivation to do something that gets that builds that chemistry with the bad guy. They have to really build up that heat with the bad guy and make us really care about them. I mean, they're part of people have to care about the bad guy too. And I say sometimes they have to care more about the bad guy than the hero in some cases, because again, they drive that conflict. Um, when I was writing the first ISIS, one of the things I did when Eastine was a villain is I really focused on how she was the polar opposite of ISIS in the way that she had these father issues, just like ISIS had father issues with Osiris, and how she was the total contrast, how she had pretty much let her anger and hatred for her father, or adopted father, consume her, whereas Isis was struggling, with her unresolved issues with her father. And we saw that polar opposite and how it led to the building to the conclusion of the story. Um, and it's very important for your bad guy, to have that in there. They have to have these motivations that really get the reader involved with the story and really get them to connect with the reader. And their experiences have to be something that the reader has to identify with too. They have to see part of themselves in the bad guy, just the way they see part of the good in themselves. And this is what balanced storytelling, really features, because you have to see all the elements come together which form the story. And a lot of people, again, they don't really think about that villain, but you really do have to think about that villain. You really have to, because this is what an iconic villain, you know, comes out as. That this is how iconic villains become icons, because we see how how their views um, are how their views I gotta think about it, are the polar opposite of the good guys, and why this is what the good guy should stand for, and this is what we should care about, on a human level. This is very important for the reader and the viewer. To this is what's going to connect them to your bad guy. And I look at comics today. I look at a lot of fantasy stories, and the bad guys pretty much are non-existent, or because a lot of like I look at a lot of DC comics and Marvel comics, it's like a big gray area, and that's not really what the fantasy, science fiction, serial type storytelling is. You really need that. You can't have it in the gray area. It's always the story model has always been designed to be a black and white story model, from its inception back, as far as I say, 1920s, 19 teens, when people were doing pulp fiction. This is and then it evolved into comics and science fiction and fantasy. All of it was all the model has always been a black and white model. It's never really been a gray area model. You always had your hero, you always had your villain, you always had your you always had the goals that they wanted to pursue, and all of it led to these obstacles being in people's way, and then that moved the story forward all the way from the inciting incident, to the first plot point, to the second plot point, to the climax, and then the conclusion, and then the end. And that's how the model has always worked. Because I've watched a lot of different, serial formats, and they all follow the same model. And when I look at a lot of today's stories, a lot of people are trying to, deviate and differentiate. And their stories are really suffering because they're not really following the paradigm. Um, and a lot of people, they haven't really studied the paradigm, and that's why a lot of, again, their stories are suffering. And because they're not really putting that bad guy to the forefront, they're not really pushing that heel. And because the heel is the contrast to the hero, and they're not really focusing on that. They're just putting the hero up there and just putting people there he can easily beat, and that's not really much of a challenge. Where they focus, on long expository sequences about this hero, at the house or with their friends. Now you can do stories like that, but they cannot be the norm. There has to be that conflict that drives it, and because a bunch of guys sitting around at the house is not really something anybody's going to pay money for. People pay money for conflict. They pay money to see the hero overcome the bad guy, and they pay money, for an entertaining adventure. And a lot of times I look at comics that you're not really getting that. You're getting, you know, mega crossovers or, expository sequences. You're not getting that balanced, 3-act paradigm that, keeps people coming back. This formula, again, has been proven, over the last, I say, almost 100 years. And a lot of people, they don't really understand. A lot of people today, they're not really understanding it and understanding why it works and why it always works. And again, I look at that bad guy, that's one of the things I look at when I first start a story. I mean, before I even put down the first word of a story, the first thing I'm thinking about, is who the heel is and what they want to do, and why should the reader care about what the heel is doing before I come in and bring the hero in and say, what they want to do and how they're going to overcome this bad guy. And, why should we care why the hero overcomes the bad guy? And I know my process is kind of really a lot very black and white, but I mean, I've done some gray area stories here and there, but I really prefer the black and white model because it really helps the reader get a better understanding of the characters and better understanding, of how things go, and it really defines what their mission is, and it establishes a strong direction that the reader can easily follow. Because, as I said before, the hero is the reason why you buy the story, but the villain is the one that sells it. Because if you have a good villain, the word of mouth is going to get around about the character, and other people are going to tell other people um, about what makes this hero great, and then because it's one of those elements people take for granted is your villain. Now you have to really think about what motivates them and what they want to do, and I really urge people, just if you're a creative person, really just focus on the heel before you start focusing on the hero, because it's really gonna change the way you do stories, and it's really gonna make your story a lot easier for the reader to get into and easier for them to access and really, connect with both characters. Um, you're going to be able to connect with both characters and really see what their mission is about. You can buy my ISIS series books on Amazon. They're in paperback and on Kindle. And you can buy The Temptation of John Haynes on paperback and Kindle as well. Many of the ISIS series books, like ISIS Wrath of the Cyber Goddess and ISIS All About the Goddess, and ISIS Power of the Princess, are available on Kindle Unlimited. So you can buy those. You can not buy those. You can buy those. You can buy them for 99 cents on Kindle, but you can also borrow them because they're on Kindle Unlimited. And The Temptation of John Haynes is also on Kindle Unlimited, and you can borrow that book if you have Amazon Prime as well. So I have a lot of great books on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited, and I also have them in paperback. So you can see the story models I'm talking about and how the bad guy really helps move the story forward. You can see that model in action in my work. Um, and again, you can just see it there. And that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.